Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for
Hello.
having us. Super exciting to be back. Well, most of you won't know that we're back. It's obviously many of you are in your first years. Ben Vickers and I did a very similar talk in 2020, just I think at the start of the pandemic. And was sort of the talk was kind of dedicated to reflecting on the first issue of future art ecosystems. So it's interesting to be back kind of 2 years on when there's a different shape to kind of the clusterfuck that we all inhabit. But there also seem to be like a lot of interesting threads that have kind of kept the work that we started then alive into the kind of manifestation that we'll be able to share with you today. And yeah, perhaps, I think maybe we'll go straight in introductions, Eva. I think Joel did a good job of introducing me, so I'm R&D strategic lead. This is a position that grew out of this practice-based PhD that Joel mentioned in my introduction. I guess the aim of that PhD, it was quite sort of an interesting animal insofar as it was hosted by the Serpentine, but it wasn't really, so I saw myself as working with Serpentine rather than inside Serpentine. That kind of allowed for the necessary distance to the organization to think actually on this sort of topic of organizational augmentation from a slightly more, I guess, kind of distanced and hopefully a bit more objective perspective. But ultimately what that led to was creation of this position, R&D strategic lead, which I consequently occupy. So I no longer have the kind of benefit of distance foresight. So I'm a totally biased actor at this stage. But perhaps also worth mentioning that apart from kind of developing this new role within the art organization, which we can also kind of this new role could, in a sense, be seen as also some form of organizational augmentation in terms of what curatorial capabilities are about within the context of arts technologies or digital strategy at arts organizations. But I guess the more important part that we'll be focusing on with Eva today is sort of giving you a bit of a narrative around how we worked with what was given to us at Serpentine in order to introduce kind of new operational methodologies and languages around communicating the value of an R&D driven approach to artistic production within a contemporary art institution. So I guess ultimately, my interests are within these back-end aspects of cultural production and how they structure the interfaces between art and society. And so to that extent, I think technology is a bit of a Trojan horse insofar as we can smuggle any other really kind of large infrastructural constellation with which art interfaces and perhaps the similar kind of questions about organizational models and reconfiguring organizations would emerge. So that's just an aside to kind of, although we are focusing here on art and tech, I think a lot of the same questions are equally as relevant in relationship to other kind of larger topics that are not technology based. Eva, on to you.
Thanks so much, Joel, for the introduction and for having us today. I won't repeat what you said, but I'm trying to think what else might be useful as an introduction. I mean, it might be interesting to know the other members of our team. So the way that we work is I'm working as a curator, Victoria is working as a strategic lead, but ultimately she occupies some sort of curatorial oversight as well. We work with a senior producer and another co-curator. Currently, our head of department is on maternity leave, but so typically it would be 5 people, which is a relatively large team given the size of the whole organization, and it's a testament to kind of Victoria's work and Ben Vickers' work over the last several years, gaining investment from the institution into the whole project of arts technologies. So today we're going to talk to you a little bit about the genesis of the Arts Tech program, the role of infrastructural praxis in reshaping the program, and then we thought it would be nice to give some practical examples of how we put this to work in lab structures, in a digital commission, and in the strategic briefing that Joel also mentioned, future art ecosystems. And then we're going to give you some insight into a new research project that we're working on, the third in our strategic briefing, which we're currently researching. And we have some questions also to pose to you guys. So the Arts Technologies Department at Serpentine was formerly known as the Digital Department, and it was spearheaded by the curator and writer and kind of shaman at large, Ben Vickers, who occupied the role of digital curator. That's something that was entirely new for the field until 2017. And then he occupied the role of chief technology officer, which was even more sort of both strange and groundbreaking until 2001 when he left. So that meant he was working on things like the CRM and data management, transitioning the GDPR strategy, as well as all of the digital commissions and larger projects that we were working on. Ben was really interested in bringing the knowledge and practices of digital transformation in the museum sector. So those are things from the operational side, like I just mentioned, and also communications, you know, the fact that museums would have a website or a Facebook page or a social media presence. And he was interested in bringing those sort of operational things into alignment with the curatorial and the artistic and the ideas side of the organization. So an example of this was to embed artworks into the user interface of a website, which he did with Cecile B. Evans. That was a kind of artificial intelligence or assistant that visited you as you were experiencing the website. That was in 2013. And if we look back at that, it seems sort of experimental and something that now we've moved into this kind of professionalized phase of digital strategy where you wouldn't probably see something like that happening. So this experimental ethos would lead the team to think about how we could best work with advanced technologies, including mixed reality, games engines, machine learning, and other forms of AI as an organization, and to what extent, you know, we would have to stop business as usual and change the way that we engage with artists and commission artists, and the way those projects can build institutional knowledge and also our capacity to produce. And by that, I kind of mean that we wouldn't be outsourcing the work, say, to a tech company. And it's around this time in the organization's history, 2018, that I joined. And also we had our first meeting with Victoria, who was a PhD student and already at that time had lots of ideas about how to augment the institution and center capabilities that I just described through a research and development platform. So when we were considering the Museum of the 21st Century and the infrastructure that would be necessary to build and support that vision that we were building, we drew this timeline. And it charts the museum's place in culture. We were considering how to bring it from a tool of culture into the future in this sort of last right-hand side. And maybe take it into the future as a site for development and experimentation, and maybe even on the behalf of the public interest instead of, you know, sponsors' interest. And there are many reasons why the 20th century model for our institutions is failing, or, you know, we consider it unsustainable. Since you're in Suhail's class, I'm sure you guys are speaking about this a lot. But most prominently, I think we can consider how these sites and sites like Serpentine failed us more recently during the pandemic. So I will try to tell the story through the lens of this aerial view of Serpentine in Kensington Gardens. It sits across two gallery sites, north and south of the Serpentine Lake. And many people who pass by the institution are completely unaware of the activity and the kind of programs that sit outside of the gallery spaces, exhibitions. Actually, a lot of our footfall comes from the use of the toilets. So some people are not even aware of our exhibition spaces. But it's also largely because the institution itself doesn't see those activities as having value in the same way as the site. So the exhibition site as paramount, or what we call the white cube model, produces a value system in the organization where the institutional knowledge that gets archived, the metrics that we use to measure success, and so on, all point back to the space. This is an image from Future Art Ecosystems 2, for those of you who had a look at the PDF. So what we're seeing here is the kind of, that in all of the places that we resource, whether that's social media, editorial content on the website, an events program, they're all designed to get people into the space and to create footfall. And so what happens, of course, during the pandemic, when the site is unavailable, it's really left the organization reeling. So now I'll hand it over to Victoria to speak a little bit about, value and capabilities in the museum that are less articulated, and why it could thrive with a new model that's centered around research and development.
Yeah, actually, if you could hold just for a second on the previous slide, just the previous one with the models. Sorry, I'm having a schedule issue. I'm doing a talk. Sorry, my child has just arrived. Anyway, so I guess here what we see is that the whole kind of raison d'etre of the organization. Hi, Ilya. This is my son, Ilya. I have a talk now. Thank you. Okay. Sorry. In this respect, it would be much nicer to be on a stage, an auditorium. So actually, there's a really good reason to maintain the white cube model. So there could be a separation between home and work. But in any case, in the pandemic, obviously, and it became kind of obvious that the institutional value system that's kind of based around the public space as raison d'etre of the organization doesn't really work when there is no physical space to go to. And of course, it was an extreme condition. Nobody, we hope that this isn't something that will be a recurring phenomena, but nonetheless, I think what it drew attention to is that currently cultural institutions fully identify themselves with their brick and mortar spaces. And all of the operational processes, all of the funding models, kind of all of the organizational agendas are really based around that kind of primal identity with the bricks and mortar space. And I guess what we started doing a few years before the pandemic, so actually if we go to the next slide, was already kind of pose that question around, is this the only way? Is the bricks and mortar model the only way really to identify what a cultural organization is in a context of, let's say, a larger societal fabric of organizations, particularly in relationship to the art and technology space? So when I started my PhD in 2018, at that stage, we didn't really know that what we will develop will be an R&D platform. So this is a slide from like an early proposal as to how to augment the existing, what was then digital department, into a department that isn't just focused on producing public-facing outputs, whether these are experienced online or in the exhibition space, but leaves space for non-public facing work that somehow augments the possibilities for the department to deliver a different kind of public value. So what do I mean by that? I mean, effectively, the kind of projects that Serpentine digital departments, so Ben and Kay Watson, who is currently the head of arts technologies, have worked on, were all in some ways kind of groundbreaking ways for artists to work with new and advanced technologies. And there were a lot of kind of lessons learned in the process of doing these new artistic commissions. However, once a commission was shown to the general public, it was archived, and everybody just moved on. So the question that my PhD tried to answer in the first instance was, what can we extract, or what can we learn from the, say, production process, the pre-public moment process, that in itself can give rise to a different understanding of the role of the arts organization within general societal fabric. So eventually what we kind of developed with this sort of slightly more, I guess, in-depth understanding of what a department is. So instead of just considering the department in terms of the outputs that it produces at this kind of higher level, which we see at the top, we need to also kind of think about the formats, non-public formats that can provide R&D for the outputs, and then some sort of, holding space for these other types of formats that can evolve. So we understand that, the formats themselves are subject to evolution. So, we used to do digital commissions. It might be the case that we might do something else that is, for example, the future art ecosystems, that's a publication. We have labs, but perhaps in the future we won't have labs and we'll have a different type of format. But all of these formats, they lead to some kind of public output of some sort. And yet what is required is, kind of a space within the organization that allows for experimentation with these formats and for really kind of finding the organizational solutions to the larger questions that that the technological condition is posing for the organization. So that's what we started calling the enabling infrastructure, and that was kind of the birth of the R&D platform. So if we move to the next slide, but I guess what the R&D platform as this holding space for non-public facing R&D modules is about, it's really kind of about understanding what the technological, or I think what Suhail called the technosphere condition we live in, what it is demanding of organizations in the present era. And of course, when we say the present era, we mean a very stretched out period of time, because ultimately this question about a transition from like an object-oriented culture where the economy and society is based around production of objects rather than something else, rather than the market economy oriented way of seeing the world, is not entirely in sync with the sort of more complex, layered systems approach that digital infrastructure brings forward in today's reality. And so this is a statement from an essay that Jack Burnham, who was a curator and I think had one very loud show at the Jewish Museum, if I recall correctly, in 1971, and was never seen again. So he published this essay called Systems Aesthetics in 1968 in Art Forum, where he sort of pronounced in a manifesto style way that there is a need to move from an object-oriented to systems-oriented culture where change emanates not from things, but from the way things are done. And in many ways, the sort of emphasis on the way things are done has been the mantra through which we have attempted to do the organizational augmentation we're describing in this talk, and really kind of focusing on not just rebuilding, but configuring in a slightly different way the processes that drive our production. And hence R&D becomes a really useful placeholder for thinking about the processes rather than the final output, which is the artwork or the exhibition or the publication. But I think there's also a different way of thinking about it, not just this kind of cybernetic vision, because as I said, although we are coming from, from a kind of technosphere approach, and all of this has a very heavy kind of cybernetic logic embedded within it, we can also position this question from a perspective of kind of curatorial care, which is the next slide, Eva. And this speaks, I think, more to the question of what do curators do in the art field. And I think, usually curators are told to apply kind of logic of care to artworks, obviously, to the artists that they work with, whether they're alive or deceased, and to the kind of public outputs on which they work. However, I think it's equally as important, and once again, this was part of our kind of departmental mantra, that we need to apply the same logic of care to the operational processes, nascent technologies, and networks of people that make these artworks possible. And particularly in the context of, I guess, art tech commissions, and Eva will go into this in slightly more detail very soon, there are usually a lot of people involved, and they're involved as co-collaborators, and in a way that kind of usually deviates from this more standard kind of single authorship model that is prevalent in the art world. And that has a lot to teach, let's say, the art world more generally about different ways of like organizing authorship, crediting, but also the processes that lead to the development of these artworks and the amount of attention that should be provided to these processes. If we go to the next slide. So with kind of this process-oriented and more expansive understanding of what curating could mean in the context of art and tech, my PhD is sort of based around this notion of infrastructural praxis. And so the idea of infrastructural praxis is that we need to, as I said, pay as much attention to the back-end processes that lead to the production of art as we do to the production of the shows and the public-facing outputs. But we can't really do that without, we can only really do that if we start looking beyond the norms of the current art ecology, which is still very much object focused and very much kind of public output focused. At the same time, expanding the remit of possibilities for arts organizations beyond just producing objects, showing objects, and kind of being a public stage, there's a need to kind of consider what the mission of arts organizations is within the current climate. And I think this is something that's been happening a lot over the last couple of years. And I'm sure when Wasim comes and talks about DAOs, this is going to feature center stage. There's been a lot of emphasis on thinking about new organizations from a mission-driven approach, where the mission isn't just to kind of support the arts or support artists or contemporary art or whatever in general, but there is some kind of pegging to a specific issue that might be relevant to a specific technology or might be relevant to a specific societal issue. So in this way, kind of art and a particular larger societal mission become enmeshed. And personally, I see that as a very positive development insofar as the diversity of missions that art is able to accomplish in society rises significantly when you have organizations that are dedicated specifically to those sort of issue-specific agendas. And although it's very hard to do that in the context of a legacy institution, which has a very general mandate, with a department like ours that has a sort of semi-autonomous existence, we try to do that through the networks and collaborations that we develop with external actors, and by kind of acting in a way that platforms voices and conversations that would usually not really be part of a more generic kind of art world context. And this ties in with the idea of testing new rationales for circulation. Once again, I'm kind of repeating myself a lot here. The normal rationale for circulation within the institutional framework is to provide opportunities for the general public to interact with art. With the R&D approach, I guess we argue that there could be different motives and motivations for circulation that an art institution could support. So for example, currently we have a number of partnerships with academic institutions where effectively we act as a shadow R&D lab to a lot of questions that researchers have at various stages of their research development. And that those researchers use the R&D platform and the labs in order to reflect on those questions and to kind of test them in conversation with artists, in conversation with practitioners from multiple fields. So in a sense, this type of, let's say, knowledge circulation or hosting of conversations that couldn't really happen elsewhere isn't really usually what we would associate with the role of a cultural organization, an art institution. But this is definitely something that we're very invested in as part of the R&D platform. And also something that we have been really looking into in terms of like, what other ways on top of the R&D could we support, what other modalities of circulation could we spawn effectively through the R&D platform? So there is the academic one, but with the rise, let's say, of Web3 and new models for supporting artistic production and also art economies, there's this like big question that's that a lot of arts organizations are trying to answer, like how do we interact with those contexts of circulation? Is there a role that arts organization can play there as well? And we'll come to that question hopefully in the end of this conversation. So this is of course really kind of tied to this question of locating new sites and models of value generation. So once again, at what stage does an art organization produce value? Is it just at the stage of showing the work? Or once again, is it also through R&D processes? Is it through being able to host conversations with different types of stakeholders and to bring people into alignment in rather unusual configurations that are not really possible in any other societal contexts? And perhaps there are many others. And finally, this is what I guess a lot of DAOs and are really interested in, and it's sort of creating decentralized autonomous organizations within the crypto space, and that is designing situated dependencies with actors from different fields. So by situated dependencies, what I mean here is instead of seeing the art field as an autonomous sector, we understand that it is intrinsically enmeshed with a lot of other sectors and spaces. So instead of kind of departing from a position that we exist outside of these enmeshments, how can we use these dependencies in order to be able to fulfill the missions of our organizations and also potentially evolve the missions of our organizations? So let's go on. So if this sort of preamble was more of kind of theoretical piece in terms of the questions that I tried to pose in my practice-based PhD and to work through with the team, the kind of practical manifestation in terms of what the R&D platform is, as it has been constructed by our entire team, looks like this. So effectively, a year ago, so this is dated, we still have 4 labs. There are 4 labs: legal lab, blockchain lab, creative AI lab, synthetic ecologies lab. All of these labs are led by external principal investigators who are obviously sort of specialists in their fields, but have some kind of hybrid practices ultimately. So for example, Alana, she's a lawyer, but also a curator. Ruth, she's a leader of the blockchain lab, but she also runs Further Field. Many of you might know her. It's an organization in North London. Synthetic Ecologies Lab is led by Yasmin Sherry, who's both an artist, but also a designer and interface, I think creative interfaces designer. Yeah, is that the right way to put it, Eva? And Eva will talk about the creative AI lab in a second. So these labs run on a methodology that was developed on the back of the kind of observations and questions that I have just elaborated on. And although these labs do produce public-facing outputs, such as reports or events or prototypes of some sort, kind of their raison d'etre is to investigate questions relating to the subject matters that they're focused on. So for example, Legal Lab is focused on the legal relationships, the legal side of things between art, tech, and science, and to investigate these questions by producing new knowledge, sharing this knowledge, and also trying to develop collaborations and partnerships that will lead to creation of hopefully some kind of infrastructural injections, such as development of tools and resources in order to target certain issues that relate to that specific area. So, you know, for example, once again, in relationship to the legal lab, there is this big kind of haunting question of translating languages between those who work in technology and those who work in art, and how to best do that in a setting of, let's say, signing a contract. So, you know, a possible tool could look like kind of a translation mechanism that tries to cohere these two spheres. So these are the kinds of things that we're looking at after the publication of our report, which has already actually happened a year ago, that identifies kind of the critical legal issues in collaborations across art and tech. The larger report that we put out is the Future Art Ecosystems report, and we'll talk about it a little bit more slightly later on. And we were also at that stage a year ago part of a creative R&D group, which was effectively kind of a ground up initiative by a lot of organizations in the UK, many of whom were early kind of explorers of what a slightly more adventurous form of digital strategy could mean in the context of an art organization. And these organizations formed a creative R&D working group in order to kind of reflect on what this first era of digital transformation has meant for the cultural sector, and how we now need to move on to a different paradigm of understanding what creative R&D is in the cultural sphere, and making certain policy recommendations.
Cool, thank you, Victoria. So I'll just go into a couple detailed case studies of some of the things that have been said. So the Creative AI Lab was launched kind of at the same time as the first report, just right during lockdown, and it's a collaboration between Serpentine and King's College London. And it was started by myself and Dr. Mercedes Buns, who's a head of department in digital humanities at King's College. And it's grown since then to include a PhD student and 2 more professors, one more on the curatorial side, Joanna Zelinska, and one more on the computer science side, Daniel Chavez. And it's important to sort of ground this in the fact that it was born from my experience commissioning and producing work that used machine learning or different forms of AI while I was an associate curator under Kay Watson. So together we worked on, she had worked on a project by Ian Chang called Bob, and together we worked on projects with Yana Sutella, Hito Sterl, and most recently Daniel Braithwaite-Shirley, which have machine learning like deeply embedded in the sort of conceptual narrative of the project, and also it's a key technical tenant. And what's important about this is that Kay really set the groundwork, or she was doing the work, as Victoria said, of curatorial care in building teams, technical teams, and also people who could provide theoretical grounding, and also how to credit those teams, also thinking about how we as curators would be embedded in those teams, acting as producers or kind of technical managers embedded on the institutional side. And during that time, and having had that experience, what we realized is that there was a lot of intelligences that were lost when you just moved on to the next project. A huge part of that is, of course, the way that budgets are structured and comms schedules or communications schedules are structured, that you kind of do that work and produce the final product and move on. So it was through this learning and conversations with Mercedes that we realized there was a lot of things in her research that could be answered with parts of our kind of experimental production process that never saw the light of day. So it was essential for us to make space within the organization to develop this research agenda and the kind of new organizational models and funding models that would necessitate. So the lab is something that could reach outside of Serpentine as an organization, and by partnering with King's, which is obviously a research institute, we could gain or have access to research status and therefore research funding. And the way that I mentioned, the budget timelines, and the way that research funding often works is in much longer temporality. So we might have 3 years to undertake research or 5 years to undertake research. And it's also interesting that that funding mandates the production of knowledge and prototypes rather than the production of something that would create footfall or clicks, etc. So they just have a different set of metrics of success, like I mentioned earlier. And it's important to note that the work was not primarily for the general public, which is quite like dramatic for a public arts institution to admit to, because we have a mandate to this sort of general public. But ultimately, we felt that there was important work to do within those smaller communities who had very specific directed research agendas, like the digital humanities department. And it was important to us also to see if this relationship could be mutually beneficial. So I mentioned, the access that we had to funding, or, the access we had to certain expertise. But I think that was really reciprocal. We provided we do provide access to producing live events, to that kind of behind the scenes working praxis of an artist, and the kind of it's a different emotional relationship that curators have to the artists that they work with compared to an academic who's undertaking an interview or a series of interviews with an artist or for their team. We have a much more intimate relationship with artists, and what I've heard from the academics that I work with is they just have like a kind of unparalleled access to both the artists and their teams, their working practices, and also the kind of like vulnerabilities and problems that arise, and insights into the kind of solutions that get devised in those kind of intimate closed spaces. And I think it's provided a new level of kind of ability for them to critique that work being in that back-end environment. So we started by building a database of creative machine learning tools and courses and research. And this was really not something that existed in the space at the time. And when we moved on to creating events and commissioning new writing and kind of trying to fill out some of the spaces between the kind of super academic or very technical machine learning resources that were available and the kind of interest and language of artists working in that same space. Okay, so now I'll move on to one of the commissions that we launched just at the end of March, called Hive Mind. But I'm going to give you a little bit of backstory as to where it came from. So when Victoria and I were in the very early stages discussing the labs and discussing research, we were thinking about how might we bring some of that research to the public through some kind of editorial content. And would that be like diary kind of entries on Serpentine's Arts and Idea platform, or would they be informational videos? And what we decided to do is commission an artist collective that's based in Berlin called Trust to do a piece of research into community-driven video formats. So we looked at the kind of tutorial videos in the communities that they galvanize. We looked at MOOCs. We looked at different institutional frameworks, whether those were like paid subscription models where you attended a course over a long period of time, or one-off videos. We looked at music production studios and how they live stream and how they do interviews with the artists that they work with. So it was really like a landscape overview. And we ultimately developed this format, which we called R&D Labyrinths. That was a way a kind of game format for artists to play through the backend environments that they were creating. And what ultimately happened was that this work, the R&D Labyrinth, was a prototype in its first stage. You know, we created, this was like right during lockdown when everyone had a bit of Zoom fatigue, and we were trying to create something that was a lot more alive, and that where we could communicate with our audience and where artists felt closer to their audiences. So the R&D Labyrinth format, when it first launched, it wasn't actually a live playable game. It was something that required a lot of post-editing. So we came up with this idea of the framework of a labyrinth as a kind of metaphor for the artist's team, brain, and like the kind of various paths that you go down while developing a creative project, you know, the dead ends that you hit, the kind of circular activity that happens where you feel like you're going around in circles until you reach the center. And it was really important to us to like stop at certain points and to show where something was unlocked. So what you see here is an example of an artist, Rendon Johnson, showing the kind of natural language processing software that they use to help them write plays, and all the different artists who are sharing their backend interfaces, sort of watching along and giving commentary. And as Rendon reaches different parts in the labyrinth, this sort of flower emerges, and you see a kind of conceptual turn in their project and in their thinking. In this case, thinking of language as a kind of infrastructure. And since these were sort of successful and they opened up a new possibility to invite more artists into our kind of fold, to expose more artists to our public, and to really have a more embedded conversation about how the work was being produced and the thinking process, we decided to commission Trust as the digital commission artist. So obviously that's like internal language that I wouldn't expect you to understand, but each year we do a kind of hero digital commission project. So in the past, it's been the artists that I mentioned, Jana Sutella, Hito Style, Jakob Kunstinsen, and they always create a kind of one-off work that really exists in their own world that they've built. Whereas in this case, this year, what we asked of Trust is to build us a tool essentially for continuing the R&D Labyrinth series. So we asked them, how can you build a game that allows artists to archive and share not only a finished artwork, but the tools, data, and experiments they have built to bring their work into existence? And to answer that, we worked collaboratively. They worked as a team of 3 with an interface designer, a kind of project manager, and a developer. And they all had a role in sort of conceptually designing the game, which they called Hive Mind. So I think I have some photos from it. Yeah, so it's this whole world that they built out, and a system which allows the game player to, just before they enter the labyrinth, to upload an inventory of materials. So that can be 3D assets, MP3s, video assets, or like, yeah, JPEGs of whatever. And it's used to describe their project. So each hive that you enter then in the Hive Mind complex, which is the labyrinth, prompts a different question. So here we see the question, show me turning points or dead ends in the creation of your tool. And at that point, the artist can go through their inventory and pull out those different assets that they uploaded in the beginning of the game. And the idea here was not only to create a game environment and an interface for artists to share their work with other artists and artist teams, but also to build a community around that. And we've chosen Twitch as a kind of home for our editorial content and for this commission. We're not necessarily advertising Twitch as the best platform ever, but like what it does allow that typically you wouldn't see in a kind of Zoom environment when a gallery is broadcasting is a kind of direct interaction with the artist's community, and this ability for what they say in the chat to influence what's happening in the game environment. I think I'll pass it back to you, Victoria, to talk about Faye.
Slightly kind of moving registers, but in some ways also not. So if, let's say, kind of Hive Mind presents this interesting transition from this annual digital artistic commission being this kind of bombastic, kind of public facing artwork, from that to let's say kind of an infrastructural, creative infrastructural tool that is also an artwork, but is effectively a platform for other artworks to reveal their back-end processes. I mean, sorry about all the levels of kind of meta-ness in there, but it's kind of like trying to turn something inside out and kind of to sort of reveal the multifaceted kind of nature of artistic production, specifically when it concerns art and tech. But I think we can definitely apply this across the board to very different artistic practices. So that, Hive Mind is kind of a representation of this sort of inside out approach from, bombastic public facing commission to something that is very much about revealing the processes that lead to the production of art, positioned as an artwork as well. So in parallel, as I mentioned previously, we had these kind of larger questions about the role of a public art institution, specifically in the context of larger kind of developments that are related to the rise of Web2 platforms, development of various advanced technologies that have become, part and parcel of our everyday life. So that was, neatly summarized by Joe in his introduction. So there's kind of much larger questions for arts organizations to answer in terms of their response, in terms of their kind of adaptability to that climate. So Future Art Ecosystems was launched as an annual strategic briefing 2020 to kind of provide it says here, concepts, references, languages, and arguments that can be integrated into operational agendas for 21st century cultural infrastructures. So this kind of concept of 21st century cultural infrastructure for us is really critical in order to communicate the essential role that we believe public arts organizations fulfill in the wider kind of context of societal infrastructure, and the essential role that artists play kind of within that space, particularly in relationship to advanced technologies. So this is the position from which Faye is written. And the need for arts organizations to really think critically and be very self-aware about how they evolve in response to new technological conditions. So ultimately, the reason for putting Future Art Ecosystems forward as this annual strategic briefing output was to bridge what we saw as a bit of a gap between, let's say, the more critical discourse that existed within the art field in relationship to tech and to kind of various digital conditions, and let's say the more market-oriented mobilization of technology that perhaps we could glean insights from various reports like UBS art market reports, etc. So our idea was to produce a piece of strategic work, for the benefit of the public cultural sector that is written from the position of the public cultural sector, and so doesn't really have that kind of, let's say, bias that a more kind of market-oriented report would have, but also doesn't kind of fall into the trap of just pure deconstruction and very necessary critique of the technologies, but actually tries to put forward some suggestions as to what organizations could do. And so Future Art Ecosystems was, as a project, as this annual strategic briefing project, was initially developed together with Rival Strategy, which is a very kind of niche strategy agency that works with a variety of different organizations in different sectors. And that was one of the main reasons why we wanted to work with them, because we really wanted to understand how to position cultural organizational strategy in the context of other strategic projects happening elsewhere in society vis-a-vis kind of the new digital condition. So we created this A/B list quite early on in the process. I think this was still like 2019 or maybe even 2018. That sort of positions transitions from, you know, how the art world it perceives itself right now or is perceived, and what we hope the development and annual publication future art ecosystems could lead to. And so some of these tropes and some of these themes I have already kind of gone over in terms of, you know, singular art world with this kind of very monolithic understanding of what an art organization or what the, you know, art sector is for, to the slightly more kind of diversified ecosystem or ecosystems of art worlds, art industries, etc. Then, you know, in 2018, there was still this kind of very stark structural contradiction between the very ambitious claims and like very kind of ethically oriented claims of the art world, and then the very, you know, kind of neoliberally oriented ways in which the art industry worked. So, you know, our idea was to use future art ecosystems as a way of kind of communicating the different economic paradigms and models were possible that could be in kind of better alignment with the more, let's say, the more kind of discursive claims of certain projects. I'm not going to go through all of these because that will take too much time, but I guess the kind of the last form about reform or revolution was more kind of an observation that generally art institutions, you know, they sort of tend to claim that they are working towards reform. Whether they actually do that or not is questionable. And then you know, entities that are kind of anti-institutional, that trying to change the establishment, right? They kind of, there is a claim for some kind of revolutionary need to completely, let's sort of, you know, transform the entire fabric of what the art world is. And I guess with future art ecosystems, our interest was to see how an art organization could become a space that could produce forks, that could produce deviations from business as usual, not through just pure kind of reforming and consolidating, but yeah, kind of giving rise to seeds of projects. So I guess HiveMind is a really good example. Our initial collaboration with Trust is an example of that. You know, how could we nurture something that is kind of quite weird in the context of the dominant structures of the art world, and then hopefully, you know, through the process of nurturing that, it could create the chain reactions that would lead to eventually, hopefully, development of new art ecosystems. So if we move to the next slide. So the first future art ecosystems was there really as existed sort of as a way of mapping what we saw as the key trends in terms of kind of providing directions for the development of the art tech space. And, you know, we identified some kind of key actors from tech sector as a new kind of cultural actor, not just purely a sponsor, but actually, you know, an actor that wants to become like a proper recognized cultural entity within societies. You know, we also identified art stacks, which are these kind of vertically integrated artist studios that are responsible, that are capable, you know, capable of producing everything from kind of their own technology to devising their own business models to, you know, showing their own work. So like Team Lab was an example that we used in regards to that. But really, like, most of the observations that went into that, which were put together in the back of a series of interviews with various practitioners, they existed to kind of develop a new language around art and tech and public arts organizations, as well as material that could be fed into operational agendas of other organizations. And whether or not that was going to be successful in 2020, when we did this talk with Ben, we're not sure. We don't really know whether this is going to work. But interestingly, a couple of years down the line, we get a lot of we get a lot of feedback from people who write to us to say that they've been hired as consultants for X organization to rethink their digital strategy, and they have plugged in quotes and diagrams from Future Art Ecosystems 1 and 2 in order to support like slightly more ambitious understanding of what digital transformation could mean in the context of that organization. And of course, this is really like the best endorsement that we could ever receive, in the sense that this sort of function of this strategic briefing / report as a holder of like public knowledge that can create more ambitious digital strategies for the benefit of, for kind of some sort of public mission is super nice. I mean, what the scale of that is, of course, we don't really have the stats on it, but apparently, anecdotally, this does indeed happen. So then moving to Future Art Ecosystems 2, that was developed and published during the pandemic. Eva had already given a bit of a preview on that in the very beginning, but we wanted to focus on the metaverse. And now this sounds a little bit kitsch because of Facebook's transition to Meta, and because everybody is just sort of really kind of going in on the metaverse piece as much as they can. But back then it wasn't really a term that was circulated that much, at least when we started this research. But we were sort of the key question that Future Art Ecosystems 2 tried to answer is, what kind of readaptation do cultural organizations to go through in order to adapt to this kind of second or third generation of digital transformation that is brought about by the metaverse? So the next slide, please. I'll try to move through this very quickly. So, in the beginning, Eva kind of outlined this sort of white cube model where the bricks and mortar space is the epicenter of the organization that structures all of its processes. In Future Art Ecosystems 2, we proposed a slightly different approach to understanding the role of the art organization in the context of the metaverse, and we position this as to the slightly kitschy title of UX of art. But what we kind of mean by that is the focus of the institutional value is really not on presenting final objects, but focusing on the art experience and the construction of the art experience as a process that is highly consequential in terms of the delivery of the public mission. UX of art also implies that any institution has a range of types of users rather than just the general public. And once again, I understand the concept of users maybe a little bit like grates people's ears, but it was really kind of tactical insertion of that term for us here because of this constant kind of need to prove utility for the general public, that we don't know who that general public is. So argument was that actually we need to really become much more specific about the different types of users that an institution has, and not all of which, and I've already said this before, might be there just in the exhibition space. They might be in other organizations, they might be researchers, they might be specific community groups, and only by understanding those specific user groups can we really kind of get down to the mission of the organization. The diagram on the right is sort of a sketching out of the different layers in which the kind of metaverse involvement, for lack of a better word, could be conceptualized for arts organizations. And it's just, we could have broken it down into these stack layers in order to, I guess, communicate the kind of complexities that that become apparent when we start thinking, what does it mean for cultural organizations to like really take on board this whole metaverse vision, and like what kind of questions should we be asking ourselves in terms of the infrastructures that we want to participate in, the kind of public-private partnerships that we want to be building in order to be able to deliver, you know, on the kind of metaverse promise, etc. If we go to the next slide, Eva. And so here, this is effectively these kind of larger circles. These are individual organizations within, let's say, a hypothetical world where organizations become much more kind of mission and user focused in a way that connects to the type of capabilities that they have as organizations and what they produce in terms of output. And in this kind of hypothetical world, we imagine organizations that are much more interoperable with one another, where instead of like one organization having to do the R&D and the exhibition space and have like a really good metaverse platform and I don't know, be an excellent community actor within a specific area, it's like, what would it mean to think more holistically about the institutional art organizational climate, and what would it mean also for policymakers to consider organizations not as discrete units but as interoperable organizations that can have these sort of situated dependencies that make them stronger rather than make them constantly compete for funding and relevance and visibility. So on the back, Eva, next slide, on the back of this kind of pipe dream of interoperable art ecosystems, we are researching and hopefully producing in September the final in this trilogy, Future Ecosystems 3, called Art and Building Hybrid Worlds. And what we want to investigate, what we are investigating, is the possibility of like hybrid organizational systems that straddle art, Web3 or DWeb or DWeb technologies, should rather say, and delivery of public value. And the reason we're doing that is because we think that this kind of question of interoperability cannot be just considered at the scale of the art field alone. I think there are a lot of possibilities that are opened up through the kind of Web3 and the DWeb space for devising kind of new organizational models. At the same time, it isn't really clear how this largely kind of privatized space relates to delivery of public value. So this is where we're kind of posing the questions like, what is the role of a legacy institution within the rise of these potentially productive and generative hybrid worlds, but which also have like a lot of questions in terms of their accountability, a general accountability, but also kind of accountability to various missions that traditional organizations used to serve. So that's the kind of slightly unusual intersection of areas that we are investigating with Future Art Ecosystem 3. And I think that kind of leads us to our points for discussion. So although we don't have any answers yet, but I think the question that we're trying to answer is like, what role should legacy institutions play in the emerging landscapes of cultural production? And that kind of relates to different definitions of hybridity that we might have. So DWeb and Web3 are, one possible space around which we could devise hybridity, but there are potentially many others, and that are also not technology related. So, I understand there are a lot of artists with a lot of different interests in this group, so it'd be interesting to open up this discussion perhaps, in relationship to, whether this notion of hybridity kind of resonates with then how you're thinking about, the future of the art field, and whether you have any also specific comments in relationship to like Web3, DWeb, as infrastructures and spaces where that you could leverage for developing your practices. I think we'll leave it at that. I mean, this was pretty labyrinthine in itself. So thank you so much for sitting through that. And yeah, hopefully we can answer some questions.
Maybe I'll put the questions in the chat so you guys can have them without sharing screen.
Thank you both so much. That was an incredible deep dive into the back end of all this incredible research you've been engaging in for years, and sharing that with us in such a coherent way, very well organized and super helpful. I want to, ask the students to respond to your questions, or if they have questions, also for you, to develop those. Something that seems quite inherent in this whole transforming ecosystem is, the transformation of institutional cultural practices, but also like kind of individual or collective artistic practices being reframed as research. And in FA1, you talk about also these 4 trends that are emerging, and one of them being the need for the artist to continually develop narratives for their work. And I'm wondering if you have a kind of, what sort of, I know sorry, I'm terrible at asking questions, but I'm imagining this for the art students that are here, like to understand these new developing roles in these hybrid terrains, about the changing systems, to start to understand their role as narrators and researchers. And I think you're both specifically excellent interlocutors for this.
I can start. I guess I see that transition from being called, or considering your practice a research practice, a really important shift. And I think that's has to do with the sophistication of artistic practices going into new technologies, that they or like, I can just speak from myself. At first, when I graduated from school, was really interested in performance, and I started using machine learning in the kind of superficial way, until I realized like how complicated it was to build my own data set, to work with a developer, to get really acquainted with the technology so that I could adequately engage with it. And it just created a completely different framework for working with the technology, where me and the woman that I work with, we had to completely redefine our practice, which until that point was very visual and very production, building objects and performances focused. And I think that institutions haven't created the necessary new ways of working that align with those new kinds of practices.
Thank you. Victoria, did you want to respond to this like shift, or there's another thing that I'm seeing kind of, I'm not sure how it's developed, but this kind of democratization of the processes of artistic production, which you talk about specifically with Labyrinth. And maybe like what is it that's, is there something that's motivating this change, or could you just maybe elaborate a bit more on that, because I think it's really interesting.
I mean, do you mean specifically in relationship to like specific technologies, or do you mean more generally?
I mean, with Labyrinth, it was like artists showing artists the back end through a kind of gaming environment. Or I've seen like LACMA residency calls saying like, if you guys are going to work with AI systems and stuff like that, we want you to build tools that other people can also use. And that is also something in the ecosystem that I find to be quite a new emergence.
I mean, I guess, maybe a lot of net artists would disagree with us, right? And I think maybe this has to do also with the kind of evolution trajectory of the internet, that ultimately, like in the early days of the internet, artists were very kind of active participants of like using these, at that stage, I guess, rudimentary kind of infrastructures as part of their artistic investigation, but also kind of production of a certain public space. And, that kind of changed with Web 2 and with like platform, big social media platforms. And, some people also say that the change had to do with, I guess, transitions in kind of hardware and the need for whoever wanted to engage with certain technologies to kind of buy into the hardware in order to have kind of any form of artistic kind of agency within that. But I think where we're coming from, and I guess maybe Eva could speak about that a bit more in terms of the AI interfaces aspect, is that there are a lot of, there are really two sides to this. There are certain, I guess, technologies that are making production processes much more accessible in some ways. And these are, let's say, game engines, right? And then on the other hand, there are certain kind of emerging technologies which are yet to be fully, like their potentials are yet fully to be understood. And that has, I think a lot of AI technologies are within that category. And so kind of the role of the artist here is perhaps, or the role of the art organizations, to provide an environment where on the one hand, there can be an engagement with technologies on the technical level. On the other hand, there could also be a space for kind of narrativizing the possibilities of these technologies beyond the market-oriented narratives that are attached to them within the more kind of corporate context. But yeah, Eva, I just wonder whether you wanted to say something specific to kind of how Creative AI Lab has been thinking about artists' engagement with these with AI technologies.
Yeah, I guess I agree with everything you said, and maybe I can just speak on behalf of King's. They're really interested in the gallery space as a site for critical inquiry that doesn't, they position, like, for instance, Mercedes used to be a tech journalist, and the way that she writes in recent publications is that those sites like tech journalism or tech critique don't exist as much anywhere outside of the art world. And so, like, the art world developing sufficient literacy around those technologies and to be able to use, their capabilities as a place for producing discourse is really important, and also a way for bringing the sort of public in to be able to use those technologies. So I'm sort of talking about two things at once. Like, on the one hand, there's the interfaces that artists are making themselves, or developer/artists are making themselves. On the other hand, there's the audience interaction, which I think that Kings are particularly interested in, which is like a space where you might for the first time see data sets that get used in a GAN, that you've seen an image of. And so it's kind of this last relic of a space where some of that didactic work can be done. And it's interesting because in the UK context, and I would say probably in the US context as well, like being too didactic in museum spaces is, considered gauche or something like that. But in the Netherlands, in Belgium, where I studied and where I exhibit a lot, that's like a necessity of the space, is to bring technology, to be able to communicate it in an understandable way. And they spend a lot of time on that invigilation, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting, the different art worlds and their ecosystems. And when you were talking about mission-driven institutions, I was thinking of HKV's Anthropocene project, for example, which was this long multi-symposia, multi-exhibition way of thinking and producing and sharing new knowledge and things like that. We don't have any questions, so I'm going to try and get some secrets from you. So you talk about new languages, new organizational languages, new institutional languages. And one that I was surprised not to hear was this term co-creation. So I know that in kind of academic circles, there's this term for working collaboratively across industry stakeholders, academic stakeholders and artistic stakeholders, and then, maybe community groups or something. There's this term co-creation, which has specific methods and et cetera, languages as well. And I'm wondering if, like, if you have like some other secret terms for us to start opening our mind into these new hybrid worlds where studios have, you know, scientists and philosophers and artists and architects and designers and theater people and circus people and, you know.
Do we have secret worlds? I mean, we used to be very embarrassed by all the terms that we would come up with. I think initially we were really unsure about art stack, but ultimately we were convinced it was the right term because, because of this kind of, as I explained, the layered integration of very different capabilities, but still it's an artist studio, but it's also an art institution, also a distribution model, also an R&D space for developing new tech. So I think RSEC is definitely one of those. You know, I feel like with all of our language, we do borrow a lot from like existing, you know, R&D speak and sort of cybernetic references. It's quite intentional because I think it's, you know, when you're kind of trying to sketch out like an actionable operational horizon, you sort of have to fall back on certain very legible formats like lab, for example. You know, in many ways, whether like what we actually do in creative AI lab and legal lab is actually lab work, who knows, right? We're effectively bringing together different practitioners around questions that they investigate together and produce either kind of research or prototypes or other forms of knowledge through that. But lab felt like a good way to understand this process of co-creation, which may sit in parallel to something like an exhibition. So I think it's not so much maybe, you know, I think a lot of these, a good colleague of mine, I think it's Aslak, he kind of called these terms strategic fictions, where you sort of, you know that there's a lot of kind of hot air and maybe they're a little bit flat. They fall flat in terms of not communicating the kind of the necessary nuance that you want to communicate, but they're really useful in trying to carve out spaces for, you know, whether it's like a different funding rationale or you know, securing a way of working with a practitioner over a long period of time that would be impossible if you had called it an exhibition, etc. So so I guess for us, language is that kind of material reality through which organizations can shape what they do in the art field. And probably that happens in other fields too, but I think there's something unique about the art field where language does have that capability. And perhaps we don't use it enough. So maybe that's that would be my comment. Apart from, I'm not sure.
Thank you. We have like a couple minutes left, and I think Maria has some questions. Actually,
thanks, Joel. Thanks, Eva and Victoria, for that talk. Really interesting. Actually, I was at that talk that you, Victoria, gave with Ben Vickers in 2020. Remember it quite well. You were speaking about an outreach effort to other art organizations in order to develop this ecosystem of, you know, art and technologies. And then there was additionally this geopolitical angle that you had touched briefly on. And I suppose what I'm about to ask touches on that notion of hybridity that you've mentioned during this talk here. I mean, in this talk, you mentioned the singular art world that still exists, and, you know, in the future would hopefully adopt a more planetary system. To what extent or how, if at all, have you recently been going about that as a geopolitical concern in your work?
Eva, do you have an answer to that? As a geopolitical concern, I mean, I think it's, I will, you know, be very blunt about it. I think it's tricky To bring in geopolitics here now, because then, you know, one way to bring in geopolitics in terms of like a Benjamin Bratton kind of way, and, you know, like regional stacks and the rest of it, and that ultimately future art ecosystems, the way that it talks about technology is firmly within like the GAFA, like Euro-American kind of stack model of planetary infrastructure. Like, you know, we've tried to go on kind of tangents and commission work on the kind of Chinese stack. We worked with a scholar called Miyu, you know, trying to kind of understand more how future art ecosystems could land in the Chinese context. But, you know, in order to do this work well, it requires significant investment. Once again, like a specific mission to do that. I think with kind of our program, what we try to focus on is ultimately the UK context to a certain extent, because we understand also that the policy context in the UK is consequential on a global scale as well. So kind of trying to influence, or at least to have, some kind of some kind of intervention into how arts organizations are perceived as actors vis-a-vis the technology field in the UK is probably the biggest contribution that we could make to a larger kind of geopolitical context, realistically, pragmatically, from where we stand. But, you know, I think the art world thing, you know, once I looked at that AB list, I'm like, we're not sure we should show it again, because it's sort of, there, I think something has really changed in the last couple of years in terms of there being a realization that actually it's no longer accurate to speak about an art world. I think there's been such a sort of fragmentation of art ecosystems just through, yes, there's still some kind of transnational system for art, but it feels that a lot of developments have happened also kind of in regional areas across the world, where it's just no longer really accurate to say that the transnational art world is still like the main ecosystem of the world. So in that respect, like, I think we're already within a certain niche, and like that's maybe a really good place to end on, is that like there is, you know, we occupy a niche, and within that niche we're trying to reconfigure organizational logics, but these are not necessarily experiences that can be directly translated or mapped onto a completely different regional and geopolitical context. And that I actually see as a good thing, because I think it's also important to kind of provide space for nascent models to emerge from other parts of the world that can be responsive to their conditions. And not to say that it wouldn't be in dialogue, but it's, you know, I think the era of circulating the same kind of model for contemporary art museum that was prevalent in the 90s and early 2000s, it's over, right? Like, it just no, and thank fuck it's over. Like, you know, it's like, it really makes no sense to do that anymore. So in that respect, like we operate from that understanding, but also from a slightly kind of humble position of like not wanting to overreach. so like what we position here is very UK oriented. It's also GAFA stack oriented. And it is kind of, I guess, Web3 oriented, once again, in relationship to response to Web2, which is once again GAFA stack and, you know, Euro-American context.
I think if you're UK oriented, you are in some ways inherently oriented externally as well, just given, you know, London especially being a hub for multiple cultures. Really, just one more quick question, if that's okay. I know it's probably time to go, but so wait, how do you mentioned that you come across tech lying outside the public eye that you wish to engage with. How do you go about doing that? How do you come across these, you know, either new artists or new modes of technology or digital working that you end up wanting to work with?
I wish we had more of a like solid methodology that we could point to, because I think we are sort of victims of being products of our context, and we take lots of steps to try and put ourselves in other networks. But I would say the biggest step for me, at least, has been, you know, entering into the King's sort of sphere and having access to a different kind of network of like ideas and speakers and kinds of conferences to go to, where I'm much more like close to the metal, in the sense that I'm hearing about development projects and I'm hearing about research groups. And I think most recently I've sort of pivoted to being much more interested in like developers who are also artists, just because that's like kind of the field of vision I have right now. I guess, yeah, that's my honest answer.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you both so much for being with us today. That was really incredible. Incredible research, incredible work. Check out the FAE 1 and 2, and we're going to look forward for number 3. And enjoy the rest of your incredible
Thank you,
week.
guys. Thank you so
Yay.
much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.